Let's talk about the extraordinary Thomas Merton. I've posted the introduction to this book, The Way of Chuang by Thomas Merton, on Moodle, and I'd just like to bring out a couple themes. It's quite early actually in the kind of Western reception of specifically of the Shuangzi. I mean, the Tao Te Ching had already been kind of worked pretty thoroughly by the late 50s. And the Shuangzi have been translated, and pieces of it have been translated. I think the definitive translation, which is Burton Watson's, was still on the horizon, but I think maybe Merton actually knew Burton Watson. They were both at Columbia at different times, but maybe they overlapped as well. But anyway, Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk. It's an extraordinary life. You might want to look it up. Kind of bopping around the world from childhood, really. Having all sorts of experiences and, among other things, a beautiful education, multilinguistic, among other things, at some of the best universities in the world. And apparently sort of a wastrel as a young man, maybe not any worse than many. A drinker, a partier, a person that had sex. I mean, but all that was renounced, at a certain point. He converted to Catholicism. His mother was a Quaker, which I think is actually interesting because I hear a lot of Quaker stuff in him. Priest and a monk who spent some time, periods of silence, for instance, and lived much of his life in a Trappist monastery in Kentucky, even while bopping all around the world, having dialogues with the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese Zen master, working for world peace and specifically working toward the reconciliation of the world's spiritual traditions, which he regarded, as in some ways different, and in many ways very different, but expressions of the same quest. Rarely has anyone, and in particular, rarely has a Roman Catholic monk been so interested in all the world's great spiritual traditions. He wrote about Sikhism and Sufism, and he was interested in kind of mystical experience, and also solitude and religious discipline and what sort of experience it could yield. Anywhere it had appeared in history or anywhere in geography. And another thing that's extraordinary about his sort of religious vision is again, not unique, but particularly intense in him, is the connection of a personal transformation, which we would think of as like monastic mysticism of the sort that he engaged in so elaborately, and a social transformation toward world peace, really. And he was an anti-Vietnam activist, anti-Vietnamese war activist. He's pro-Vietnam, though, if you see what I mean. Did I point to this book, The Seven-Story Mountain? It's a classic of spiritual memoir. I remember being very affected by reading it, and very interested in a variety of spiritual traditions from reading it when I was kind of a kid. It was a big book in my set, I guess, or my parents' set. Um, all right, so that's a very inadequate characterization of the. He had a mysterious death. Yeah, that but kind of looks like a murder actually, but I don't know, man. Uh, that would be weird though. That's the last person that's. It's more like a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Okay, not someone. Well, I mean, okay, actually, some of those got murdered too. So never mind. I'm not saying he was murdered because that wasn't the. But it was kind of mysterious. All right. Um, his interpretation of the Shuangzi. Okay, it is, the interpretation of a Christian monk of the Shuangzi. But one so characteristic feature of Merton's work on different spiritual traditions is he's hyper aware of that. Okay, he's hyper aware of who it is that's doing this reading and why, and trying to interpret Shuangzi. In a way, he's trying to screen out his own prejudices, but in another way, the whole project is to make connections here. Which he does in profound ways. And one way that he establishes credibility along these lines, to my way of thinking, is that he definitely doesn't merge these traditions, right? He's also concerned to talk about the differences. The whole book also includes his free translation. I mean, he says it's not a translation. He says it's just but he worked with the top translators or some of the top scholars on it. Like Watts, actually, a little bit, who's interestingly parallel in some ways. Much more secular figure, though. They probably overlapped. Columbia keeps popping up. But at any rate, so most of the book is actually free versions. Merton was a painter. Merton was a poet, okay? Really a serious poet. And, he gives his own poetic versions, and he makes them into verse. He stops lines before the edge of the page, whereas usually Shuangzi is interpreted as prose and written as prose. But he converts it into verse. Verse, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but and gives these free versions, and they're beautiful, actually. I don't know how real serious scholars regard them as translations. He says they're loose versions. I didn't reproduce them, but if you ever want to get out into his versions of the Shuangzi, they're very delightful. All right, so one interesting theme that he raises in the introduction, I'm just going to hit two, it's not that long, is Taoist ethics and anti-ethics. This is a really difficult area, I think, or an incredibly rich area for discussion. Maybe it's not one that I've adequately contemplated. But he says this about Shuangzi's or Taoist sort of anti-ethics or concerns about certain forms of ethics, at least, specifically the sorts of ethical value systems associated with Confucianism or Ruism and Moism. Like very, quite definite moral systems. Quite different than one another, though, of course. Okay, so this is on page 22. The Way of Shuangzi by Thomas Merton. Shuangzi's concern with the problem that the very goodness of the good and the nobility of the great may contain the hidden seed of ruin is analogous to the concern that Sophocles or Aeschylus felt a little earlier in the West. The tragic sense of life. I mean, it's a very characteristic Taoist thought that trying to make everything right is liable to induce disaster. All right. So I guess unintended consequences is one of the ways to formulate even tragedy. you're not, I mean, so the tragic vision of Sophocles and Aeschylus indicates, maybe we could interpret it as indicating, that you're not going to get all the good with none of the bad. Okay? It's kind of pursuing the good. I mean, it depends on the play and the story, okay? But pursuing the good that ironically ends you in damnation or whatever, right? I mean, it's a good person that, as Aristotle describes tragedy, it's something that happens to a great person, right? That is like trying to make things better. I don't know. This could be a really dark thought, at least without the next positive move, I guess. Chuang comes up with a different answer in which there is less of religious mystery than in Greek tragedy. To put it simply, the hero of virtue and duty ultimately lands himself in the same ambiguities as the hedonist and the utilitarian, which he's just discussed in relation to a figure named Yangtze. Merton has just discussed. Why? Because he aims at achieving the good as an object, something outside himself to be realized. He engages in a self-conscious and deliberate campaign to do his duty in the belief that this is right and therefore productive of happiness. He sees happiness and the good as something to be attained, a telos, a la Aristotle, and thus the telos, according to Aristotle, happiness and the good, and thus he places them outside himself in the world of objects. In so doing, he becomes involved in a division from which there is no escape between the present, in which he is not yet in possession of what he desires. So the present is intolerable because you don't have what your whole life or the meaning of your life is dedicated to. That is the ends that you project into the future. Between the wrong and the evil, the absence of what he seeks, and the good that he hopes to make present by his efforts to eliminate the evils. Between his own idea of right and wrong and the contrary idea of right and wrong held by some other philosophical school, and so on. Like, there's a problem with, this is Merton's reading here, with the abstraction of ethics, and of at least some ethics, some ethical systems, and their teleological orientation, their goal-oriented nature. And then the question is, can you have values that don't do that? Like, don't say like, oh, this world, it ought to be quite different. That is, it ought not to be what it is. Right? All right, now that's a hard way to live in the world in a certain way, right? And according to Chuang and Merton, or Merton's interpretation of Chuang, it's liable to backfire so badly. You're liable to be doing exactly. You're liable to achieve just the opposite of what you intend. And that's because of, one reason for that is because that's the nature of the universe, it's a interdependence of opposites. So he says, this is on 23, the more one seeks the good outside oneself as something to be acquired, like a possession that you might, have in the future, the more one is faced with the necessity of discussing, studying, understanding, and analyzing the nature of the good. The more, therefore, one becomes involved in abstractions and in the confusion of divergent opinions. The more the good is objectively analyzed, the more it is treated as something to be attained by special virtuous techniques, the less real it becomes. You lose it by over-theorizing it. It just dissolves into an abstract mist. And I must say, that's a reasonable criticism, if you ask me, of a lot of Western ethics. It just dissolves in general principles that don't actually help, okay, in real situations. And as the end becomes more remote and more difficult, the means become more elaborate and complex until finally the mere study of the means becomes so demanding that all one's efforts must be concentrated on this and the end is forgotten. I mean, you're never going to achieve these ends anyway, actually. Really, probably. The utilitarian end of a ecstatic population as a whole or whatever. Hence, the nobility of the Ruse scholar, the Confucian scholar, for example, becomes in reality a devotion to the systematic uselessness of practicing means which lead nowhere. All right, so I keep saying things like this, but maybe I need to think harder. Like, could this be an ethics? Is this an attack on all ethics? Could another ethics, a Wu-Wei ethics maybe, emerge from this? And if so, how? Okay. And maybe actually alternative philosophy of action as well. Like, why do human beings act and how do they act and what does it mean? Okay. I guess I want to just kind of give a couple of indications that, or moments that I think show that Merton really has Chuang-Tzu on board. Of course, maybe, who am I to judge that? But I think there are, the kind of beautiful moments where you can see that Merton's very intense personal experience, I think, is connecting him plausibly to something that's central to Chuang-Tzu. Now, someone like Merton would be happy to say that, maybe. Across thousands of years and across cultures, languages, and the globe, he thinks that, for example, people have this kind of monastic or mystical tendency. Like, there's a universal, there's an underlying universal possibility of experience that maybe Merton and Chuang-Tzu both gained access to or something like that. I think Merton kind of thinks that. There's a lot of problems with that, including the cultural gap. Merton was pretty damn responsible in trying to get across that gap to whatever extent he could. But this universalism is something, I'm not sure how to adjudicate that one either. But he says things like this is right at the end of actually the note to the reader on page 12. He kind of ends it like this. In any event, the way of Chuang-Tzu is mysterious because it is so simple that it can get along without being a way at all. Least of all is it a way out. And you may recall the guy who just rolled, got swept down Lulang Falls, who says, "I have no way." And, so I think this is a basic good insight. Like you could take a lot of the stuff in the Tao Te Ching or the Chuang-Tzu as this very elaborate guide for, spiritual discipline or whatever. But at the heart, and they say this all the time, it's incredibly simple. And I might say this about Chan or Zen Buddhism too, another big interest of Thomas Merton's. This great dialogue between Merton and D.T. Suzuki, the great Zen teacher. And that is like, there is nothing to realize. That's what you realize. That's what enlightenment is. It's actually all around you. You never didn't have it, actually. Okay? It's just like doing the next thing in your life, maybe. You never cease to be totally connected to your environment, for example. You may have undergone the delusion of separation. And that delusion of separation is in the heart of ethics, according maybe to these folks. You thought of yourself as kind of a sealed off ego, distinct from the objects around you and administering them for your purposes. The point is not to engage in a elaborate spiritual discipline to break that down. The point is just to realize that that was always an illusion, that you've never ceased to be totally connected with the world, and hence, inside and emerging from the Tao. All right, and so here's a passage to that effect, maybe. Okay, that's the wrong one. Where are we at? This is on page 27. One may call this humility, Chuang's humility, cosmic humility, not only because it is rooted in the true nature of things, but also because it's full of life and awareness. It's not a withdrawal from the world, but a kind of a certain kind of engagement with it. Alternative to like means ends rationality as a way of engaging with the world. Responding with boundless vitality and joy to all living beings. It manifests itself everywhere by a Franciscan simplicity and con-naturality. That is, we are natural together, all of us living creatures. Half the characters who are brought before us to speak the mind of Chuang-Tzu are animals, birds, fishes, frogs, and so on. Chuang-Tzu's Daoism is nostalgic for the primordial climate of paradise in which there was no differentiation, in which man was utterly simple, unaware of himself, living at peace with himself. Is this something you want? Unaware of himself? With Tao and with all other creatures. But for Chuang, this paradise is not something that has been irrevocably lost. It's not something lost by sin. I mean, this is an interesting comparison. And which can't be the Christian tradition, which cannot be regained except by redemption. This paradise is still ours, but we don't know it. Our existence making us forget who we really are by causing us to become obsessed with what we are not. And one way to become obsessed with what you are not is to become obsessed with what you ought to be, as opposed to what you are, and obsessed with what the world should be, as opposed to what it is. And that's the danger of ethics, according to Merton's Chuang-Tzu, and which I think is in there. One might connect this to the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche as well, but that would be a hard, long slog. All right. I guess that's it for this one.